Welcome to USA Global TV and Radio, where our mission is to provide education, entertainment, hope, and inspiration. USA Global TV and Radio connects you with experts and audiences all around the world every single day to help you succeed in business and to live a richer life. Visit us at usaglobaltv.com to learn about career and life-changing training and mentoring programs like the Listening Mentor. Subscribe to our newsletter to stay informed about our special programs and offers. Discover how you can become a guest on one of our shows or a host or producer of a USA Global TV and Radio show of your very own. That's USA Global TV and Radio, where the doctor is always in.
Hi, Reverend Laughlin here. We're on the Corner Bookstore today with on the USA Global TV and Radio Network, and my guest today is a Dr. Janet Polach. Janet's an author. She's a global coach, leadership development professional. She focuses on development. She focuses on a lot of things. We're going to talk about it in her latest book, a couple years old, called 7 Mistakes New Managers Make. So why don't you join me, Janet, and let's get into your book and your career in writing and a little bit more about what's going on in the world of Janet.
Nice to meet you.
I noticed in your resume that you're a former, actually former lieutenant colonel in the United States Marine Corps. And I was reading just a little bit about the beginning of your book that was not necessarily something you planned on. It kind of developed. Tell us a little bit about that.
You know, if we're in a huge group of people doing a workshop or at a conference or something, and we ask people, you know, who planned to be a doctor or a lawyer or the head of HR when they started their career, most people don't raise their hand. And I was the same way with joining the Marine Corps. I graduated from college in the Midwest with a degree in education. And unbeknownst to me as a 22-year-old, there was a recession going on. So jobs were a little bit hard to come by. So I looked around and said I could get a master's and be especially unemployable, or I could do something else. And so the something else turned out to be the United States Marine Corps. Probably the best decision I ever made in my life. I learned about leadership in the Marine Corps. You know, the Marines do leadership, I think, better than, I guess, anybody else on the planet. They invest in leaders, they set standards, they measure against those standards. And that then formed the underpinnings of the work that I do today, which is helping executives be successful, helping their teams be successful. And where a real sweet spot, which is why I wrote the book, is those brand new frontline managers. How do they become successful quickly? Because so many of them aren't successful or fail in that first couple of years.
Well, in the military, as you said, they develop great leaders. Marine Corps, absolutely one of the best. There's no doubt about it. And I'm a veteran also, so I'm glad to have another vet on. We don't have that luxury all the time. So the thing that I like is that you learn by a lot of mistakes. But then after a certain period of time, you're expected not to make those same mistakes again. And depending on what branch of the military you're in and where you're at, sometimes that mistake is the last mistake you ever make in your life.
Absolutely. The stakes are high.
But when you're leading other people, that is a skill. That's something that most people don't have. In your military career, when did you first start feeling comfortable leading others? That's kind of where I want to start, because I think your book leads in very, very nicely, because you have to have a comfort level to do something well, I believe.
Well, I think, Red, thank you for the question, because it's thought-provoking and reflective. And I think a military experience, especially as an officer, is so different than most of our civilian counterparts experience. So in the Marine Corps, for example, you go through officer candidate school, which is like boot camp, and then you go through your military specialty school. You also go through something in the Marine Corps called the basic school. Many of the services have it, which is, we tease, it's a 5-month finishing school. You learn about tactics, you learn about weapons, you learn about protocol, you learn about military law. So you really learn all the essence of being a second or a first lieutenant in the Marine Corps. And then you go out to your first command. And to your question, I felt prepared, but I didn't feel confident. I was leading, as a 23-year-old, I was certainly leading nearly everybody who was older than me. I was very, very green, and everybody knew it because, you wear those gold bars on your shoulder and it says inexperienced. And so I think you learn by trial and error, and you learn by following others. I had a captain that I reported to. I had a lieutenant colonel who was the commanding officer, who were all, I would say, very much behind me to make sure that as a second and a first lieutenant, I was successful, which I do believe I was.
Yeah, we used to call the basic school knife and fork school.
Exactly.
But as you say, there's so much training. For me, being an aviator, Navy, by the time I finally got to a squadron, I no longer wore the ensign bars. I was already, in fact, that's another story. But regardless, that military career, when you first start out there, you feel like you're prepared, but that confidence only builds after you give the orders and you start, okay, I could have done that better. And you learn some lessons, and you see other people do things. And so now you've developed your leadership skills, traits, whatever, in the Marine Corps. Now you're transitioning to civilian world. Tell us about how that transition went.
Well, for me, it went fairly well. My husband and I were living in Washington, D.C. And so I transitioned to a very large government contractor, Computer Sciences Corporation, which does a lot of weapon systems, software systems, has a great play in the Hubble Space Telescope. And so making that transition was fairly easy because I worked with a lot of military veterans, and we all spoke the same language. I got off active duty and I started working on the human resource development side for this large company in Washington, D.C. And then immediately started working on how do you further develop leaders on the commercial side. Yes, many of them transitioned from being on active duty, and yet leading in a commercial sector versus leading in the military is different. You leverage some of those same skills, but leading in a commercial environment is much more collaborative. It's much more asking rather than telling. It's bringing people along. And in the military, we don't especially necessarily teach that. And there's a very good reason we don't, because the military is focused on mission accomplishment, which, as you already said, Red, is often life and death. And, you can't, in a life and death situation, you can't say, well, everybody, what do you think we should do next? You have to be decisive. You have to take action. And for most of us on the commercial, the nonprofit sector, we have the flexibility and often the time to be able to bring people along and say, all right, here's the plan. What questions do you have? How are we going to all make this work? How do we get everybody on board?
Biggest thing I saw leaving the military, and that was right after Vietnam, was that in the military, you have a captive audience. They're not going anywhere until they transition to their next duty station. But in civilian life, they don't like their boss, they're gone. They don't like the company, they don't like the economy. It doesn't matter what it is. They don't have to like. Now, my own personal deal is, if 2 out of 3 things, either you like your boss, you like your pay, or you like your coworkers, any 2 of those 3, you'll stay. But if all 3 of them are out, you're gone. And that's hard to do. Attrition is very hard because you got to find somebody that's qualified, and then you got to train them. And that takes a long time. Yeah. I noticed in your book, you talked about individual contributors becoming leaders.
Yeah.
And that's a very hard transition. I mean, I had a lot of engineers and people that are very technically competent in what they're doing, but they've never been a supervisor. They've never been a manager. They don't know how to budget. They don't know how to talk to people. They don't know how to value. They don't know. So why don't you run us through, let's say I'm a particular customer that you're coaching, and you're coming into, how am I going to get my frontline new managers who used to be individual contributors at least up to a level where they're functional?
Yeah, great. Exactly, Red. So I think, first of all, this is a problem across America, and I think it's a problem across the world, having worked internationally. We take really great individual contributors. They know what they need to do. They report their progress. They learn the skills they need to, and then, ta-da, they're promoted to a manager. If we did a Venn diagram, that we said managers are over here and individual contributors are over here, there's only about a 20% skill overlap in terms of things like communicating or planning work. That certainly overlaps. And yet we promote people because they were great individual contributors. They're expected now to work through others. And I think that's the biggest change. And it's a mindset change, which is I don't no longer get everything done the way I want to and get it done myself. I have to set expectations. I have to provide coaching and feedback. I have to provide accolades when it's done well through other people. And then, of course, the trick as a manager is that each person is a little bit different. I was coaching an executive yesterday, and he said, I have 4 people. I'm going to work on their development. And yet all 4 people were very, very different from one another. One was new in her career and ready to be a mom. Another one was very, very experienced and taking on a new assignment. The other 2 were kind of in the middle someplace. And so they were learning, and he was learning and growing as a leader while he was learning and growing his staff.
I really and truly like the example you gave a moment ago, a Venn diagram, something so easy to see, but not necessarily explained that eloquently, because that is really and truly a nice explanation of those 2 individual groups of talents, but the intersectional places where they're the same is probably at 20%. In some industries, maybe less, in some industries, maybe more, but I like that a lot. That very well done.
Yeah. And Red, back to your earlier question about, as a manager, how do you get these new leaders ready? I think you can teach them the basics. Certainly you can buy my book and read all about it because the steps are in there, but it's things like setting performance expectations. How do you very clearly say, here's what you're expected to do by when and to what degree? Having regular one-on-one conversations with them, not just to talk about workload, but to talk about how are they doing, giving them feedback on a regular basis, and then helping them learn and grow. I think those are kind of the 4 big tenets of what a manager does in terms of interacting with whether they're individual contributors or brand new managers, and teaching them how to do that is really critical.
Yeah, you talked about the 4 people having literally different cultures. It's almost like in the military, you have a certain expectation within the culture of the Marine Corps. It's going to be a little bit different for infantry than it is artillery, than it is for aviation. But then if you get into the Army, you have the Air Guard, you have the National Guard, you have, Army. I mean, just each one. In the Navy, you got surface, air, and subsurface. The cultures, the mindsets, they are all totally different. And it takes a long time to understand not only what it is, but what's important to that person. And that's a hard one to crack. But
it is.
I think you're right about, you can teach the basics just like the basic school. They're basics. Everybody should have the same level of coming in. So tell me, I think in chapter 2 of your book, you started talking a little bit about tools that people can start using. I know that one of the tools that they used a lot on me, both in my military and in my civilian, was the Myers-Briggs. I must have taken that 7 times. And of course, they have all sorts of other ones that are similar, tweaked a little bit differently. But the tools that you use are there to assess the individual's strengths and weaknesses, but also the ability to do that job. So let's talk a little bit about tools for a few minutes.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned Myers-Briggs, and there are lots of assessments on the market like that, Insights, Discovery, DISC, and so forth. And what those do is help me understand, how do I prefer to interact with other people? How do I, do I tend to lead with more language, being more extroverted, or do I need to think it through? And so those kind of assessments help us as an individual understand who I am. What's more powerful, though, in those tools is now to understand how you are. So, Red, I may have my preferences in interacting. As a leader, it's more powerful for me to know how you prefer to interact, and I interact in that way. So I think those self-awareness tools help. We certainly have 360s that we do, whether they're structured in a set of questions and you do it all online, or what I do an awful lot with executives is I interview their colleagues and capture comments about what do they do particularly well, what don't they do particularly well, and then building that, again, self-awareness about how I am as a leader. And then, of course, leadership development and coaching, I think, are two outstanding tools. Coaching is one-on-one. Leadership development, I think of as more classroom. Here's 1, 2, 3 steps in how to give feedback. Here's 1, 2, 3 steps in how to have a really highly effective one-on-one conversation with people. So I think there are many tools. Some of these can't be used by yourself. I've worked with organizations that have done self-managed 360s, and it's just a disaster. You need some context. You need somebody who's been there, done that, who can provide some perspective and context.
It's interesting in many, many regards. I taught a PXO, PCO course, Perspective XOCO, and I took a look at the criteria, and the first thing that I saw was it doesn't tell you how you can get fired. How can you get so we created, that was the very first thing we taught. If you're going to be in charge, what are the things that you cannot do that,
right,
your butt's going to be out the door the next day? And that's something that we intuitively, we think about it, but it's never something explicit. I noticed that most of my career, civilian and military, it was all trained for the company. I was never trained to improve me as an individual. But some of the things you're talking about actually do improve you as an individual. At least that's what I'm hearing. Is that a fair assessment?
Brett, I think that's absolutely right. Yeah.
So when you take a look at that individual as a first frontline manager, frontline supervisor, you talk about the tools, but you also talk about developing teams. And let's kind of wander into the team building for a little bit, because I want to stick pretty close to your book, because that's why we're here. You're an author, and then we'll get a little bit down the road as to how you decided to get there. But that's down the road. We have time for that.
Okay, great.
So about team building.
Team building, in its simplest form, it's getting the team, say there's a team of 6 or 8 plus the boss together in a room to talk about how we are going to work together. I think so often in this very fast-paced environment most of our organizations operate, it's all about what. What's the project? When are you going to get it done? Hurry up, get it done faster. And yet we don't pause to say, what are the guidelines for how we're going to interact? If somebody sends you an email, for example, what's the expectation on how quickly you will get a return? Is end of the day suitable? Is 2 hours from now expected? Is sometimes before the end of the week? Now, if you can imagine that scenario and 5 different people on a team, and somebody's operating with, if my colleagues send me an email, I'm going to get it back to them within the hour, and somebody else is saying, if I get it to you by the end of the week, I'm good, tensions arise. And so team building is all around understanding each other's priorities and their styles, and then creating some guidelines for how we can work together and what we can expect of each other.
When you have 2 people together, or 3 or 6 or whatever, you always have that situation. When I'm interviewing people, I have some level of assessment that their technical skills are there to do the job, but I'm looking for how well are they going to fit into the culture that I have in my group. So if I have one team member who does not want to be there, who's a troublemaker, who whatever it is, yeah, I need to know that and be able to take some action. So how do you identify those people that fit together very well and can work together well, and that one or two little oddball situations where no matter what you do, this person's just not going to work out in this job?
Right. I think we've all had a chance to work on really amazing teams. I'm thinking on a team that I did some really remarkable work around career development at United Health Group, and here in Minneapolis. And I got to work with just a tremendous team of about 10 people. We were all focused on our objective. We all helped one another out. And over time, as often happens, one or two new team members joined the team. And we were all feeling a little bit of growing pains, like, gee, it's just not the same. And I think what happens, rather than thinking, gosh, those two new people are misfits, it's, again, taking the time to reground the entire team. Now that two people have left, those skills have also left. These new team members, how do we fit them in? And I think so often we don't take that time to not only onboard the new team members, but onboard the team as it is now with this new set of players. And I think that's one of the biggest reasons that we have these disconnects with individuals.
I've noticed with some, particularly if you just bring up an engineer to a supervisory level, they're going to make mistakes. And somebody else on the team is going to come in and say, can I talk to you? And I have to explain to them, yes, I know they made a mistake, but they have to learn from their mistake. There is a learning curve, and that has to be explicit, because they think that I don't see it or I don't recognize it. But the people have to make mistakes. If they don't make a mistake, that's very rare. But the learning curve, they can't make the same mistake, 15 times in a row. There's a certain latitude you're going to give them. But sometimes you stick somebody in a job and you don't give them any training, and that's almost as bad as anything else. So when you're assessing team dynamics, this part of the team over here might need more software training. This part may be more sales training. There's different parts of the team that require certain things. And they say, well, that guy over there is doing something that I want to do. But so there's a lot of feedback going back and forth. And for a new manager, that can be overwhelming because they don't know how to deal with it. So how do you help that new manager handle those little disgruntled employees at the first sign of trouble?
Right. I think one of the skills that I teach over and over again to new managers and to experienced leaders is the art of asking great questions. So often we're nervous, we're unsure of ourselves, and so we move into telling mode. We tell them what they should have done differently. We tell them how to do it right. We tell them what they're going to do differently next time. And yet we don't take the time sometimes to reflect and say, what was going on that made that decision? What did you learn from that mistake that you made? What might you be willing to try next time to do it differently? And so I think one of the best things that a brand new manager can do, who hasn't had a lot of development, who's just been kind of plunged into the role, is get into the mode of asking questions rather than telling and giving directions and shouting out orders.
I like that, actually. I think that's a very effective way of doing business. Another section in your book deals with effective strategies. Let's develop that area a little bit. When you're in an industry, I'm down here in the oil and gas industry, that's very cyclical, that the effective strategy you have this year for a plan can evaporate literally in 3 or 4 months, depending what's happening in the world market. So I understand we set a strategy, we have goals, they're measurable, they're all the rest of that stuff. How do we change strategies?
Yeah. Well, I think what you're talking about really is the art of change management, and how as a leader can you be effective at not only change yourself, but as leading change with other people. I think you're constantly as a manager looking at the market, looking at the horizon, looking at how are we doing against our goals, and if we're not hitting our goals, then what do we do about that? And so part of that is monitoring the external environment and then having those conversations with your team. I think another challenge that brand new managers run into is they think they have to be the know-it-all. They think they have to know everything. They have to know every single person's job. They have to have all the answers. And what effective managers do is they facilitate answers from the rest of the team. Because after all, those team members probably have more of the answers. They're closer to the work. They've maybe done it before, and would like to provide their perspective. And so as the strategy needs to change, as the market changes, I think the great step is to bring your team together and say, now what are we going to do? What are the possibilities that exist? And how do we put all of our heads together to solve the problem?
I'm sure you've seen, as I've seen many times, that you have somebody in charge of the company, and they're very good when the economy is going well, or very good when everything's retrenching, but they're not good in both situations. And the board of directors is not smart enough to replace that person when they need to be replaced. But we also have that same thing at the lower levels, because that culture from the top comes all the way down, and it comes down, to the VP and to the district manager, all those things, and they get translated and manipulated a little bit and maybe misconstrued a little bit. By the time it gets down to the lower level, even if it's in writing, it's the interpretation. Sometimes I thought that's what you wanted to have done. And that's hard for a new person to grasp, because they're not used to that. As you talk about change management, they're not used to change that rapidly. And so that's how do you train somebody for something like that?
Well, I think what I try to do is give them at least a framework for change. You start with defining what's going to change and then what's going to stay the same. And I think that's a step we often overlook. I think you think about who are the stakeholders in the process, who's really impacted by this change, and how are they going to be impacted? Yes, you do a change in an organization, you could very flippantly say, well, everybody's going to change, but that's not necessarily the truth. Some people will be asked to change more because they're changing process or technology or what have you than others. And so pinpointing who's going to change and by how much, and being able to describe that to those impacted stakeholders, I think is really critical.
There was a term used many years ago, probably still is today, management by walking around. That's one that I like, because I always wanted to touch base in the various aspects of whatever the business was, particularly if there's multiple companies involved within the overall framework. And this business may be doing very well, or this division, this other one not. And even though the economy and everything's doing well, people are always, am I going to be laid off? What's going to go on? Is the company going to fall? Lots of rumors. So you have rumor control, you have all sorts of things going on. And I find management by walking around at least gives that new manager an assessment of how are their people accepting what's happening out there. And then you get that little one-on-one time where you can answer questions for them. I find that to be a very effective way for me.
And Red, in this day and age, it's a challenge, right? Because we can't just walk around anymore, because so much of our workforce isn't in the office. What I'm seeing in industry these days is, maybe 1 or 2 days a week, lots of people are around. And the rest of the days, if you show up at a company these days on a Monday or a Friday, there's just no one there. So the challenge for a new manager is to figure out, how do you quote unquote walk around when everyone is sitting at their desk at home? And so it's checking in with them. It's, using some of the electronic tools to help stay connected. And it's asking them how they're doing. When you're in a corporate environment and you're doing management by walking around, you're on the way to the water cooler or the coffee pot, and you don't say to somebody, how are you doing on that project? You generally say, how are you doing today? How was your weekend? What do you have planned next weekend? How are the kids doing in soccer? And I think that when we get in a remote environment, we forget to do those casual kinds of things. How are you doing? We have 15 minutes together. Let's talk for just a minute about how was your weekend, or what do you plan next weekend, or what are your vacation plans? And so management by walking around still makes sense, but it looks very, very different in a remote environment.
Well, that was the way I wanted to lead into the next question, depending on how you answer that one, because so much has happened since COVID that we're now virtually at home at work. And that ability to walk around doesn't have the same level of personal attachment to the boss and the worker bee. And so I was just kind of curious how that's translating nowadays.
Yeah, it is. It is. We have learned a lot over the last 4 years. And, a lot of people say, can't we just go back? And the answer is no. The real estate burn aside, there's a lot of unused office space that's getting paid for. But if we put that aside, employees do like working from home. Now, a lot of employees are finding that they don't love working from home 5 days a week. That, going into the office once or twice a week is okay. They still like the flexibility to choose. And they really like the flexibility if my job requires me mostly to be on site, maybe I'm in a call center, maybe I'm a nurse, that I still exercise some flexibilities about when do I set up my schedule. Are there certain days of the week that I have to be on site that I get to help control rather than being required to fill those days?
Well, we kind of covered your book a little bit. I know there's a couple other chapters that I didn't go into, but as an author, 10 years ago, did you think you'd be an author?
Well, I hoped that I would be. I got started in writing doing my dissertation for my PhD. You create about a 200-page book, which isn't very interesting, but it's kind of fascinating. It's not great reading, but it is fascinating. And so that gave me the sense that, yes, I can write a lot. I think then I went into blog writing. And I think for anybody who really wants to start writing, whether it's fiction or nonfiction, to think about, mini pieces, start with a paragraph, start with a couple of paragraphs. My blogs are about things that I see that are related to leadership. And that spurs me to continue to write blogs. And then over time, you get enough thoughts together that you say, yeah, I can take on a book. I wrote the 7 Mistakes New Managers Make during COVID because I had the time. It was finally time. I was surprised how much content I had. And then it took me a couple of years of percolating, and I am nearly finished with my second book, which is called The Strategic Leader's Mindset. So if 7 Mistakes is about that frontline manager, the Strategic Leader's Mindset is really about becoming a vice president and being over a much broader responsibility in the organization.
Did you just sit down and start typing? Did you have an overview? Did you know why 7? Why not 12? Obviously, you had to pick numbers and you had to do things. Yeah. So what was the mindset is 7? Why 7?
7. I said to people, who wants to read a book, The 132 Mistakes You're going to Make as a Brand New Manager? And I think any of us who have been brand new managers would say 7. Oh my gosh, I must have made 13 or 15. But 7 seems like a nice amount. That's just enough to digest in a book. I think the 7 Mistakes you can probably read in a 2-hour plane ride, which is what also was my goal. And I think when you're writing, it's like, how much, do I need to write a tome on leadership, or do I need to give people some quick tips to be even more effective? And that's what this particular book was about.
How long did it take you to write it?
I would say about a year. But I think anytime you write a book, it's a team sport. My husband is a retired English teacher, and so he was my editor. I had a great colleague named Rick Ridmaster, who's helping me with my second one. He's a very similar kind of consultant to myself, and he was willing to read the drafts and say, "Oh, Janet, you've overcovered this," or "What about this concept?" I had 2 or 3 early readers who were brand new managers who did me a favor and read the book cover to cover. So I think getting the first chapters on the page, I think, is probably a third of the effort. It's
Your book was
it's
published.
that. Go ahead.
I was going to say your book was published in 2021.
Yeah.
Tell us a little bit about how did you start marketing your book? Was that 2019, 2020, 2021? When did your marketing program start?
Yeah, I didn't start until it was done. I think because I was, you didn't know exactly when you'd get done, and having all of the text done is about 2/3 of the way there. There's layout, there's cover, there's, do you want A versus B in terms of type and so forth. And so I didn't really start promoting my book until I had it in hand. And then I started on LinkedIn. I got engaged with a number of podcasts, and people were very interested in hearing from authors, particularly business authors. And so I got a lot of exposure that way. I think my publisher, Kirkhouse Publishing, really did a great job of helping me think about avenues to get noticed, book publisher fairs and awards and so forth. I was a silver medalist for nonfiction the year I published in the Midwest. And so, again, I think, Red, it's that village that helps you get it out there and get it successfully. Because if I had to just think of all this stuff myself, I think I probably would have sold a dozen copies.
Okay, Colonel, 2 last questions before we start wrapping things up. Okay, number 1, hang on one second, senior moment. Well, let me get to the second question. Okay, first question. What should have I asked you that I didn't that you think is important for today's discussion with you and your book? And then the second question is, how can people find your book?
Great, thanks. Well, I think, what we touched on, Red, is that I believe anybody can develop into a good leader. I don't think it just happens. We have the Olympics going on right now, and we have countless stories of how hard everybody worked to be an Olympic athlete. I think being a highly effective manager takes the same kind of effort. You don't just get promoted and say, okay, ta-da, now I'm great. I think you read articles, you attend classes, you get coaching, you do a 360, you understand your style. You really work at it. And it's not just, I'm going to work on it for 3 months and then I've arrived. I think you work on it over the course of your lifetime. And then if people want to get a hold of me, Janet at janetpolach.com. It's JANETPOLACH.com. And that's my website, janetpolach.com. I do one-on-one individual coaching, but I also have a leadership development program that goes with the book that helps leaders, managers, brand new managers be much more effective managers at the end of the program than at the beginning.
Colonel, it is so nice to have you with us today, and I look forward to our next conversation, whatever part of the USA Global TV and Radio Network that you might be on. I'm getting ready to do another show here in just a few minutes it's called The Wise Ones, and I also have another author coming on for that particular program. Name is Jana Locke, I believe. We'll be talking about her book and other things, but a lot of things going on today on the USA Global TV and Radio Network, and we are very, very excited today on the Corner Bookstore to have Janet Polach, PhD, Colonel, on as our guest. And with that, one other thing I forgot to mention, right after the Wise Ones, which is the very next event, about 20 minutes roughly from right now, The next show is called Talking Heads, and I have a program today that I'm wrapping up. We've been talking about 4 weeks or so on basically how do new authors get their books written, get them published. And today I'm going to summarize everything that we've talked about before and try to wrap everything up into one session. So with that being said, Red O'Loughlin signing out, and I will catch you all on the next program on the USA Global TV and Radio Network, which is called The Wise Ones. Take care now. Bye.
Hello, I'm children's author Diane Floyd Boehm, and I am co-host for several of the USA Global TV and radio shows. I joined because of the purpose of the USA Global TV and radio. They provide content for the viewers and listeners, an opportunity for people around the world to have their own show or even be a guest on an existing show. We truly believe in helping others get their positive message out to the world. We also have the opportunity for the listeners. You can watch on several platforms, and on YouTube, you can ask questions and even give a comment. We absolutely love it. I love being part of the USA Global TV and radio because I love positive messages, and who doesn't? And we need more of that in the world. We are a family, and we hope you will join us and become part of the family too. Hello, boys and girls, and welcome to Story Garden. Your host, Diane Boehm. I'm so happy to have you here today.
Diane Floyd Boehm tells wonderful stories that warm the heart, spark the imagination, and unite people and families across generations. For children, Diane's Harry the Camel connects with all of us who've ever wondered how different our lives might have been if only we'd been born something better, like a wonderful horse instead of an ordinary camel. In the end, we all learn along with Harry that there's nothing better than just being yourself. Diane's Little Girl in the Moon looks down on earthbound children and wonders if they know she's just like them. A story of love, home, and the bond between mother and daughter, its powerful theme that we're each of us different yet all of us the same plants a seed in children that promises to blossom within a loving and trusting grown-up. Diane's new biography, Rise, recounts the experiences of her grandmother, Ruby, to reveal the hidden strength of the human spirit. Ruby's story inspires all of us to become the best versions of ourselves. You'll find all of Diane's delightful books and much more at DianeFloydBoehm.com. Visit DianeFloydBoehm.com. That's DianeFloydBoehm.com.